Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
Sound Cartel.
ESG, or environmental, social and governance factors, is a major talking point right now, especially for larger corporates. Shareholders, customers and the wider community expect more corporate social responsibility, like reducing their carbon footprint. But it's not big business alone that need to be doing the right thing. From Sound Cartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. What about smaller businesses? What does it all mean exactly? And why is ESG due diligence important for businesses of all sizes? To explain is Owen Dingle, partner at financial advisory group Mazars. For those unfamiliar with all of this, there are several acronyms to keep in mind, including ACUs, or Australian Carbon Credit Units. ERF is the Energy Reduction Fund, and then there's COP26, which was the United Nations' 26th and most recent climate change conference of the parties, held in Glasgow, Scotland. First, Owen Dingle explains to Chris Ashmore that more and more businesses are seeking clarification around their environmental responsibilities and what they can do to reduce their emissions.
People are looking for guidance, particularly around where the opportunities and costs may lay. And so they're starting to look into their business and actually look in particular at what if we examine the environmental side of things, what is their carbon footprint? What is their business actually emitting? And what steps can they undertake to reduce their carbon footprint? Because ultimately, we've seen a change in the political landscape. Within Australia, we've tended to be a little bit isolated in our view politically on environmental concerns, whereas there's been, if we look at Europe, it's probably one of the more mature markets when it comes to ESG, in particular environmental concerns. So what we're finding as a consultancy firm is that through our global network across 80 countries and 40,000 people, our European counterparts in particular are saying that this is going to be forefront of the regulatory environment in Europe, which has been there for quite a while. But more conversely, now that the US is in step behind Europe, we are seeing an emergence of people just reaching out and wanting to know, what does this mean for their business? And, if you're looking to plan for the future, how do you actually look to incorporate that into your business plan and future planning activities?
Well, let's look at that. And from a practical point of view, what does the emergence of ESG in Australian businesses and more broadly international ones mean?
It still is very much a new space, and it's one that not everybody is across. And I think everybody in the industry is actually recognising that we're all on a fair learning curve here. So if you think about within Australia, we haven't really been adopting a broad-based ESG policy as strongly as somewhere like Europe, primarily because we haven't had the political appetite to do it. So all of a sudden you've got a race to find expertise and develop those skill sets within Australia. So people are having a lot of conversations and probably talking about it a bit, but I think the maturity we're a long way off being a mature market and still very much on the learning curve.
Well, Owen, what is greenwashing and how does a business ensure that they're not being misled?
Look, greenwashing is where a company is looking to provide a solution in basically what we're dealing in an intangible space and overstating that they're actually helping the environment when they might have either taken the money and not done the right thing, or they may have sold that ACU equivalent several times over. And, if you look globally, there's many examples, and recently many boards are actually starting to ask the question, if I am spending money in this area, is it actually leading to real environmental outcomes? And I think that's really being paramount, because as a director's duty, you don't really want to be saying to your shareholders that, you're doing all these great things for the environment only to find out that you've spent good money to not really achieve that outcome that you've looked to do. So my advice here would be, if you're thinking about moving towards net zero and looking to abate your emissions, I think you really need to be genuine about the reasons why you're doing it and genuine about the people that you're dealing with, because I think it's better to do nothing than do something half-heartedly in this area, because you'll find that consumers and shareholders are not so forgiving when you might take a shortcut or do something half-baked.
What's an ESG DD, or environmental, social and governance due diligence?
You look at the various levels of emissions that your business have, and in simple terms, you do what you call a baseline, and you sit down and you say, well, what is the amount of carbon that my business operations generates within the entire ecosystem? And then from there, you actually say, well, what activities or carbon abatement activities can I undertake to actually reduce my carbon footprint? So that might be, you might buy electric cars, you put in LED lighting, you may also look to do more Zoom conferences and less travel. But then ultimately, once you've sat down and actually looked at your total emissions, you're going to have unavoidable emissions. So those unavoidable emissions effectively mean that the business has done everything it possibly can to reduce its carbon footprint. It's taken into account your suppliers' impact as well, because the team delivering your goods may actually be undertaking activities as well which help reduce your carbon footprint, so you don't have to necessarily be doubling up. And part of that ESG DD is very much looking at the whole picture. But then businesses are now looking at it and going, well, at present, outside of the top 211 emitters in the country, it's a voluntary process whereby you then go to market and you have to buy what you call ACCUs, which is basically 1 tonne of carbon sequestered from the environment. And that's basically regulated through the Clean Energy Regulator here in Australia.
Could you just explain a bit about the environmental component of ESG?
Yeah, so basically the environmental component is probably one of the most spoken about, Chris. And if we think about it in the Australian context, we've got basically two sides of the equation, one emitters and one businesses looking to purchase what we call ACCUs, which is basically 1 tonne of carbon sequestered from the environment, which is an offset. So, for example, we've got Australian farmers that can undertake various carbon farming activities, which will sequester carbon from the environment, and that might be through human-induced regeneration or carbon soil farming, and that is created with what we call a ACCU bank, which is held by the Clean Energy Regulator here in Australia. So very much a regulated market. I think one of the things we do is we beat ourselves up in Australia that we're not doing enough for the environment. But when you actually look at the science and the regulation that we have here in Australia, it is of a world standard. And so if you're a business as such and you've identified the fact that you have what we call unabatable emissions, so you've done everything that you can to reduce your carbon footprint, you can actually go along and buy these ACCUs from the ERF, or you can actually buy through the voluntary market, whereby you're then able to surrender that ACCU to then be able to get to what we call net zero. So that's actually offsetting your carbon emissions as such.
And are businesses rewarded when they do that?
Well, look, there's probably two components. There's the regulatory market and there's the voluntary market. So regulatory is Australia's top 211 emitters. They have to have in place what we call a plan to reduce their carbon footprint from a regulatory point of view. And then we have the voluntary market. So you'll notice that a lot of companies these days, and Mazars is no different, we're all working towards getting to what we call net zero. So net zero is purchasing ACCUs to offset those unabatable emissions so that the environmental footprint that we have is effectively balanced out. And so if you think about that, what does it mean? Boards in particular are very much focused on how they might be able to get to net zero. And as part of that is that ESG DD, but then what steps do you undertake? And we're seeing a real emergence of a new market there, whereby you have a demand from business owners to buy those ACCUs, but then we also have farmers out there generating accus. So in Mazars, I think we're fortunate that we're working with both sides of the fence.
Is it costly?
Well, look, that's one of the big risks for businesses, and that's where we're working with clients around developing strategies to help manage that. At the moment, if you're a farmer, for example, you can undertake carbon farming activities and you develop a bank. And you can hold that bank of accus there and sell at any future point in time. Some are actually choosing to retain their accus to use themselves. But if you're in small business, you may not have the opportunity to be able to plant 1,000 hectares of trees to help offset your carbon footprint. So effectively, you need to go to market. So really, it's about developing a strategy around how you're going to arbitrage that cost, because to be frank, a few people have said to me, it sounds a bit like Bitcoin, Owen, and there are some elements there that, you are dealing with an intangible asset. Can you see 1 tonne of carbon sequestered from the environment? Well, no, you can't. It's a bit like Bitcoin. You can't touch and feel it. But at the end of the day, you're putting a lot of faith into the system and process that the right thing's being done. So I think it's really important to realise that when you are dealing with consultants, they'll put forward a proposal to possibly go to another country and buy accus or the international equivalent for maybe a third of the price. So currently it's trading about $35 in Australia on the spot market. Previously it had been up to $60, but the Australian market was deregulated a little while ago and it fell back down. But effectively, I think when you're dealing with an intangible asset, there's a tangible outcome that people are actually paying you for this. So, my initial thoughts are that Australia is well placed to also help provide the solution, because we have a very low sovereign risk here in Australia. We do have sound science. It's a market that's been around since 2011. So business owners just need to be mindful that there is very much the risk of greenwashing, that potentially you may be able to buy accus at a cheaper price elsewhere, but is it really delivering a real outcome to the environment?
That was Owen Dingle, partner at financial advisory group Mazars. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at Sound Cartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast.
Sound Cartel.
This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more,